They wrote it like I was already gone. She won't live long anyway. We might as well start the paperwork now. That was the first sentence I saw when I opened the misdirected email, and I remember feeling not shock, not fear, but a strange, quiet warmth in my chest, as if the world itself had placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Look closely now. This is who they are." I'm 81 years old, and I have lived long enough to recognize the difference between the words people speak to your face and the truths they reserve for private rooms, back channels, whispered threads typed confidently into glowing screens. I live alone now in a small house with uneven floors and window frames that complain when the wind rises. And though the world believes solitude diminishes a woman my age, I have learned that silence is often the only space where you can hear what your life has been trying to tell you for years. But before all this, before lawyers and police and the fractured dignity of betrayal, I was simply a mother who trusted too easily, who believed that love and loyalty held more weight than convenience and inheritance, who thought that the family she raised would one day gather around her as she softened with time, not circle like strategists discussing what assets could be reasonably transferred once her breath became shallow or her handwriting unsteady. And yet here I am, recalling the moment that trust cracked in the smallest, quietest way, like the first shift inside a fault line that has waited decades to speak. I had been making tea when the email arrived, a small domestic moment that should have remained untouched by anything cruel. The kettle was only beginning to murmur. The morning light was soft and gray through the kitchen window, and I remember thinking the house smelled faintly of lemon from the cleaner I had used the night before. It was a peaceful morning, the kind that makes an old woman feel she has earned at least one calm day. And then my phone lit up. The sender's name was my son's, and I opened it without hesitation, because even after all the small slights, all the dismissals, all the ways he had begun speaking to me, as if translating a language he no longer had patience for, I still believed emails from him were safe places. I thought perhaps he was sending a photo of the children or asking about my doctor's appointment. Harmless things, soft things. But the first line told me everything I had refused to consider, that while I still looked at him with the eyes of a mother, he had begun looking at me as a countdown. I remember reading the sentence again slowly, feeling its edges, as if pressing my fingers into a bruise to understand the shape of it. She won't live long anyway. The casual cruelty of it sat so plainly on the screen, without hesitation, without apology, without the cushioning words people use when they're still pretending they care. And underneath, the discussion continued. Numbers, dates, projections, reminders about documents I had not agreed to sign. They wrote about me the way people discuss a house that has been on the market too long, detached, strategic, impatient. It was all there in their tone, in the clipped phrases and dry calculations. They weren't planning my care. They were planning my exit. The kettle whined behind me, but I didn't turn it off. I watched the steam fog the air until it curled like a thin veil in front of me. I wish I could say I cried, that I felt something dramatic or cinematic, but the truth is simpler and far sadder. I felt confirmation, a confirmation I had never wanted, but one my bones already understood, long before my eyes ever did. Age teaches you to sense the shift in how people touch you, speak to you, refer to you. There is a moment when you stop being someone vital and begin being someone optional. I had been feeling that slow erasure for years in the way my son asked, "Do you really need that?" when I bought myself something small, or how my daughter-in-law insisted on reading my medical forms aloud as if I were illiterate, or when the grandchildren began joking that I was old school for paying in cash, their voices tinged with an amusement that stung more than they intended. These things pile up, small and unassuming, until suddenly they are tall enough to block the sun. When I finally turned off the kettle, the house felt colder, not because the air had changed, but because I had. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, not to steady my body, but to steady the memory forming inside me. People often say betrayal is a sudden thing, a breaking, a taking, a moment of violent clarity. But betrayal at this age is slow, like moss spreading across stone. It arrives through years of conditional kindness, polite impatience, careful avoidance, reassurances spoken in voices too sweet to be sincere. Betrayal grows in the spaces where you are no longer asked what you want, only told what is best for you. It takes root every time you are spoken about, as though you're not in the room, every time someone assumes you will not understand, will not question, will not resist. The email wasn't a lightning strike. It was simply the first time lightning dared to be honest. I read the rest of the thread until my eyes blurred, each line peeling away another layer of the illusion I had worked so hard to maintain. There were phrases about streamlining the process, about ensuring no complications arise, about avoiding confusion on her end. There was even a mention of my medications, followed by suggestions about adjusting dosages to encourage compliance. I saw my own life reduced to tasks, legal steps, administrative burdens. I saw my existence handled like paperwork, and in that moment, I realized my age had become their opportunity. I sat down at the kitchen table because standing felt suddenly dishonest, too proud for the truth unfolding around me. The chair creaked beneath me, old wood speaking to old bones, and I placed the phone flat on the table as if it were a confession I needed to examine from every angle. The morning light shifted across the screen, making the text appear almost gentle, and for a brief second I wondered if I had misread everything, if grief or fear were playing tricks on me. But no, cruelty rarely hides. It simply waits for you to notice it. I thought about calling my son, demanding an explanation, asking him how long he had been planning this, when exactly he decided that the years I had given him, my work, my sacrifices, my love, were no longer enough to grant me dignity. But a voice inside me, when I had nearly forgotten, whispered, "Don't let them tell you what you saw. Don't let them reframe it. Don't let them shrink your pain into something misinterpreted." So I didn't call. I didn't write. I didn't move. I just sat there breathing, feeling the weight of my 81 years settle differently on my shoulders. Life had not made me fragile. People had. And yet, in that same moment, I felt a strange, unfamiliar strength rising slowly through me, the kind that comes not from anger, but from recognition. Recognition of what I had allowed. Recognition of what I had mistaken for love. Recognition of the fact that survival, at my age, looks nothing like what the world imagines. It is quieter, sharper, more deliberate. It requires no weapons, only truth. That email did not break me. It simply woke me. I did not fully understand what I had uncovered until the moment I walked into my son's house later that week and saw how easily they both smiled at me, how naturally they slipped into the roles of attentive caretakers, how convincingly they pretended everything in our family was intact, unstained, and honest. The email had been a spark, but the catalyst, the true break, came when I realized they expected me to remain blind even after setting fire to the edges of my life. I stood there in their immaculate foyer, the polished floor reflecting their curated lives back at me, and I felt the weight of my discovery settle inside my chest like a second heart, heavy, beating in slow, deliberate pulses that reminded me with every thud, they planned this, they discussed it, they believed they could shape my future without my consent. They believed I would not fight, and that belief was not born in a day. It had grown from years of small, quiet ways in which I surrendered my authority to the people I loved most. I remember watching my son pour coffee for me at his kitchen island, the casual grace in his movements, the well-practiced warmth in his voice as he asked if the drive had been too long or if my knees were bothering me more than usual. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the counter, pretending to listen, his eyes scanning my face, not with concern, but with the calculation of a man assessing a fragile artifact whose value lies solely in how quickly it might be passed down. It was the first time I truly saw the difference between his expressions, the one he wore for my benefit and the one he wore for himself. And as he spoke, I felt the widening gap between what he thought he was hiding and what I now fully knew. The catalyst was not the email itself. It was watching him lie to my face with the ease of someone who had convinced himself that lying was a form of kindness. He asked if I'd brought the bills he needed to look over, explaining that he had to make sure everything stayed organized in case anything happened to me. He said it softly, with practiced sorrow, his lips shaping the word happened as though it were a hypothetical event, though I now understood that in his private conversations, my decline was not hypothetical at all, but scheduled, anticipated, planned for, with the same precision one uses to prepare for a sale or a closing date. My daughter-in-law hovered behind him, pretending to tidy the counter, but every movement she made was too careful, too attentive. She was listening, watching, waiting for me to hand over the folder she assumed I had brought. She pretended to be distracted by the baby's needs, but her eyes flicked back to me every few seconds, measuring, assessing, calculating, like a person checking whether a fuse had caught fire. She gave me that polished, brittle smile, the one she saves for guests she hopes will leave early. Under that smile, I saw something new, impatience. She wanted this over with. She wanted my signature. She wanted the process to be complete. When I told them I had forgotten the documents at home, I saw something flicker in both their faces, a momentary break in the mask. My son's disappointment was sharper than he intended, and my daughter-in-law's sigh was too long, too revealing. She covered it quickly with a laugh, a soft wave of her hand, as she insisted it was no big deal, and we can do it next time, but her eyes betrayed her. They carried the same tone I had read in the emails, urgency, not urgency born of love or fear for my health, but urgency tied to opportunity, an opportunity that depended on my compliance, my trust, my fading autonomy. Later, when my son stepped outside to take a call, I watched my daughter-in-law open a drawer and casually slip in a stack of folders, the same type of folders he had mentioned in the emails. She closed the drawer softly, as if sealing a secret, and when she turned back toward me, her expression was smooth again, rehearsed. She asked if I needed anything, tea, water, an extra cardigan, and the sweetness in her voice was so overdone it made my stomach turn. I realized in that moment that all the hospitality, all the carefully arranged meals and polite invitations had been less about affection and more about management. They weren't caring for me. They were containing me. The catalyst came fully into focus when the baby began to cry. My daughter-in-law rushed over with the same theatrical urgency she reserved for hosting guests, and I watched how naturally she comforted the child. For a fleeting moment, I remembered when my son had been the same age, when I held him with the same tenderness, when I believed that love was a bond that time and hardship could not sever. But as I watched her cradle her child, her family, her future, I understood with startling clarity that they saw me as a barrier, an obstacle, an inconvenient remnant attached to property and accounts, and a past they no longer valued. I saw for the first time how thoroughly I had been repositioned in their lives, not as a mother or grandmother, but as an administrative burden. My son returned to the kitchen, phone in hand, his voice clipped and formal as he spoke to someone about timelines and transitioning assets. He did not lower his voice when he walked past me. He did not pause the call. He simply continued speaking, confident I would not understand or question it, but I understood every word. I understood because I had read the emails, because I had seen my name printed in cold, detached sentences, because the truth had already taken root inside me. I listened to him speak to a stranger about my future as though it were a closing deal, and I felt something inside me shift, not break, not shatter, but harden, like metal left too long in the fire. When he ended the call, he looked at me with a weary sigh, the kind meant to suggest love, concern, obligation. He told me again that it would be easier if I let him handle everything, if I just trusted him the way I used to. He said the words gently, but they carried the unmistakable weight of a man who believes the decision has already been made, that the person he is speaking to has no real choice left at all. And in that moment, I saw the truth fully. He did not fear losing me. He feared losing control. That was the catalyst, the clear, undeniable understanding that my son had begun planning for my absence while I was still very much alive, that the woman who had raised him had become a shadow he preferred to manage rather than a person he wished to cherish. The catalyst was recognizing that their plan required my silence, my confusion, my cooperation, and that the greatest threat I could pose was clarity. It was the moment I realized that survival meant not confrontation, but documentation, not pleading, but preparing, not trusting, but watching. I left their house that afternoon with the kind of calm that often precedes storms. The wind had picked up slightly, and I remember standing on the porch, hearing the faint rustle of leaves like the whisper of a warning. As I stepped onto the walkway, my son called after me, reminding me, not asking, reminding, to bring the documents next time. He said it lightly, as if it were nothing, as if the future were already his to arrange. But I felt the shift. I felt the line between us move, and as I walked to my car, the truth spread through me like a tide. They were preparing the paperwork for the end of my life, but they had forgotten one detail. I was still here. I was still thinking. I was still capable of changing everything. I did not leave their house with a plan, yet something inside me had already begun to move, like a tide shifting direction, long before the surface shows any change. The escalation, though I did not have that word for it then, started quietly, with the smallest choices so subtle that even I did not understand their weight until much later. I drove home slowly that day, the landscape sliding past me in muted colors, the sky thick with low clouds that seemed to flatten everything beneath them. My hands were steady on the wheel, steadier than they had been in years, but my breath came in deep, measured draws, as though my own ribs were reminding me to stay alive long enough to understand what was happening around me. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked different, not changed, but revealed, as if something had peeled away a layer of familiarity. It was no longer simply the place where I lived. It was the only territory left that was unquestionably mine, the one space my son had not yet found a way to absorb into his calculations, and I felt an almost territorial pull toward it, like an animal returning to a den after sensing danger. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying that faint scent of paper and old wood, that had always comforted me. And yet that afternoon, it seemed to whisper a warning instead of a welcome. I hung my purse on the back of the chair, sat down in the living room without turning on the lights, and let the shadows fold themselves around me as I replayed the conversation from his kitchen. His voice, that brisk managerial tone he had once reserved for business deals and insurance clients, now applied to me. The dismissive glance he gave when I mentioned the documents he thought he needed. The way my daughter-in-law had hovered, ready, to catch the moment I faltered. I could feel the shape of their plan now, a slow tightening disguised as efficiency, a soft cage lined with polite phrases and medical concern. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood that what frightened them most was not my fragility, but my clarity. In the days that followed, the escalation unfolded like a patient illness, not sudden or violent, but persistent. My son called more often than usual, not out of affection, but out of an urgency he tried to mask with forced lightness. He began asking what medications I was taking, when my next appointments were, whether I had been feeling confused lately, said with a careful softness that attempted to sound loving, but did not hide the probing edge beneath. When I answered him clearly, he paused a beat too long, as if recalibrating a script he had prepared for a different version of me, and each time he ended the conversation with some variation of, "We really should take care of those documents soon. Mom, it'll give everyone peace of mind." His insistence, always framed as a kindness, grew heavier with every call. My daughter-in-law began sending me reminders as well. Text messages about estate planning seminars, articles about elder care directives, links to legal templates framed as just information in case you want to feel more secure. She never used the word trust, only security, simplicity, convenience. Words chosen carefully, words meant to ease my resistance and slip past whatever defenses they believed an 81-year-old woman could muster. And though I did not respond, she kept sending them, each message another thread tugging at the life they were trying to weave around me. What neither of them understood was that, with every attempt to corral me into their version of the future, I sharpened a little more. I began to notice things I had ignored for years. The way my son's voice tightened when I mentioned managing my own affairs. The polite irritation in my daughter-in-law's eyes whenever I reminded her that I still paid my own bills. The way they both assumed my silence meant compliance. I realized how often I had let them speak for me in public, how many decisions I had allowed them to make simply because I didn't want to burden them or complicate their lives. I realized how easy I had made it for them to see me as a diminishing figure. One afternoon, I drove to my bank, not for any dramatic purpose, but because I needed to remind myself that I still had access to my own life. I asked for printouts of my accounts, something I hadn't done in years, and the teller, a young woman with a tired ponytail and kind eyes, glanced at me with a gentle curiosity, as though she sensed a story unfolding behind the simple request. When she handed me the papers, she said quietly, "If you ever need help sorting anything, just ask. We see a lot of complicated family situations. You're not alone." That sentence cracked something open inside me. For the first time, I realized this was not a rare tragedy or a singular betrayal. It was a pattern, a story older than any of us, one that too many women lived in silence. And that knowledge didn't frighten me. It strengthened me. I took the documents home and placed them on my dining table, spreading them out in neat rows, reviewing them not as a confused old woman, but as someone reclaiming the map of her own life. I wrote notes in the margins, highlighted transactions, made a list of questions I wanted answered. It was not rebellion, it was preparation. It was the slow, deliberate tightening of my own grip on the life they thought was loosening. The escalation deepened when my son stopped by unexpectedly, though I realized later it was anything but. He walked through my house with a kind of restless energy, looking at mail on the counter, opening my refrigerator, commenting on the state of my living room, as though scanning for signs of decline. He asked if I had been forgetting things lately, my appointments, my prescriptions, my trash pickup schedule, and the moment I said no, he tilted his head in that sympathetic way that suggested he didn't believe me. It was a small gesture, but in it I saw the entire structure of their plan: doubt her memory, question her habits, redefine her competence, and eventually position her vulnerability as justification. He noticed the bank documents on the table and asked why I was stressing myself over this stuff, why I didn't let him take it off my plate. When I said I liked understanding my own finances, he smiled in that patient, exhausted way that children use when explaining technology to their grandparents, and told me I was overcomplicating things. He suggested we should streamline everything. He even said it would protect me from possible mistakes, not realizing that the only mistake I had made was trusting him with the quiet parts of my life. That night, after he left, I sat in my living room with only the small lamp lit, watching the shadows breathe against the walls. I realized the escalation was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time, with subtle shifts in tone, with carefully chosen phrases, with the rearranging of our roles in a way that placed him above me, responsible for me, entitled to my decisions. And though fear tried to push its way into my chest, something stronger held its ground. It wasn't defiance or anger. It was clarity. Clarity that I needed to act, not violently, not dramatically, but decisively. I began writing things down: names, dates, details, conversations, because memory, when written, cannot be rewritten by others. I moved important documents to a safer place. I called my doctor and asked for copies of my medical files. I requested my own appointments instead of letting my son handle everything. I took back small pieces of autonomy, each one a quiet rebellion against the shrinking world they were trying to build around me. The escalation was not dramatic, but it was real. It was the slow, steady reclaiming of myself. It was the first step toward a truth I had avoided for far too long: that love does not grant permission to erase a person, and age does not grant permission to inherit a life before it has ended. It was the recognition that survival, at 81, begins not with strength, but with awareness, not with shouting, but with refusing to be silent. And as the days unfolded, I felt something inside me sharpen further, like a blade discovering the shape of its edge. They believed they were preparing the world for my absence, but they had no idea I was preparing for my presence. I did not recognize the moment things began to shift inside me, because it did not come as a burst of courage or a sudden act of defiance. Instead, it arrived like the faintest change in weather, a slow warming of currents beneath the surface, an almost imperceptible realignment of breath and thought that told me, without words, that something in me was no longer willing to accept the role they had prepared. It began the morning I finally opened the medical file my doctor's office emailed at my request, a file I had relied on my son to interpret for far too long. I sat at my dining table with my glasses propped slightly lower on my nose than usual, the print crisp and colorless on the page, and I realized with a quiet astonishment that there was nothing in those reports that matched the bleak narrative my son had begun weaving. My blood pressure was stable. My cognitive tests were normal. My mobility was reduced but steady. And nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was there any mention of rapid decline or imminent danger. The urgency they imposed on me existed only in their conversations, not in my body. This knowledge did not make me angry. It made me alert. I read through the documents once, then again, and on the third reading, I found myself breathing in a deeper, steadier rhythm, like a woman stepping onto solid ground after believing she had been walking over thin ice. For years, I had allowed others to tell me what my limits were, what my body was losing, what my mind could or could not hold. But reading those unembellished words, those numbers, those quiet affirmations from strangers in lab coats who had no reason to lie, felt like reclaiming a truth I did not know I had lost. My health was not perfect, but it was mine. My mind was not failing. My life was not ending in the accelerated timeline they needed it to. And if their plans depended on the idea that I was slipping, then this clarity, this quiet solidity, was the beginning of my resistance. That afternoon, with the medical report still spread across my table, I found an old pocket notebook I had not used in decades. Its cover was worn, the cardboard softened from time, the edges frayed like a beloved sleeve. I sat down and, without fully understanding why, began copying the most important details by hand: my medications, my doctor's notes, my insurance information, and most importantly, the dates, proof of stability, proof that the story they were building around me was just that, a story. I wrote slowly, carefully, feeling each stroke of the pen connect me more firmly to my own authority. This wasn't rebellion, it was reclamation. It was the moment something dormant inside me stirred like an old engine catching its first breath after years of stillness. The next day, I drove myself to the pharmacy, not to pick up a prescription, but to ask the pharmacist a simple question: whether anyone other than me had recently called about my medications. I half expected her to look at me with confusion, but instead, she tapped through her records and hesitated just slightly before answering. There had been inquiries, several, not from me, not from my doctor. I thanked her, more calmly than I felt, and walked back to my car with my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm, as if marking the boundaries of a truth I had not wanted to confront until now. Someone had been checking up on my medical regimen without my consent. Someone had been preparing the groundwork for a narrative of decline. Standing beside my car in the parking lot, with the sun resting weakly on my shoulders, I understood the shift that had begun inside me. Until then, I had been reacting, absorbing, letting things wash over me in that familiar way older women learn to do, quietly, without complaint. But now I felt a pivot, an internal turning of direction that was so subtle and yet so decisive that I knew, with startling clarity, there would be no returning to who I had been before. I was done allowing others to define my condition, my memory, my worth. The next morning, I went through my house with new eyes, noticing details I had ignored for years. The quiet of my own routines, the steadiness of my steps, the way my mind drifted not with confusion, but with reflection. I realized I was not weak. I was lonely. And loneliness, when misinterpreted as decline, becomes a weapon in the hands of those looking for leverage. I stood in my kitchen, feeling the hard floor beneath my feet, and realized that what they saw as fragility was simply solitude. What they called confusion was grief. What they labeled as vulnerability was trust misplaced. With this realization, something inside me shifted further. I called my insurance provider, asked for full clarification on every policy in my name, requested new passwords, confirmed beneficiaries, checked for recent unauthorized changes. There were no dramatic discoveries, but there were anomalies, requests for forms I had not made, follow-up calls I had not initiated, inquiries registered under my account from numbers that were not mine. Nothing illegal, nothing overt, but patterns that suggested someone was trying to gather information, line up documents, create a path of least resistance. I sat on the edge of my bed that night, the folder of insurance records beside me, and I felt the midpoint settle into my bones. I was no longer simply gathering information. I was preparing, not for a confrontation, but for a change in the balance of power. I realized that my son and his wife had been moving quietly, subtly, believing me too trusting or too tired to notice. They had mistaken my politeness for passivity, my quiet for confusion, my affection for permission. And for the first time, I saw their miscalculation as my opportunity. I began adjusting my patterns in ways that felt small, but were monumental in meaning. I stopped leaving spare keys hidden outside. I changed my passwords. I moved essential documents to a new place. I informed my doctor that I preferred private communication from now on. I tightened the boundaries of my world, not to shut anyone out, but to keep myself intact. And through each small action, I could feel the tilt of my life returning to center. One evening, while sorting through old letters in a drawer, I found a photo of myself in my 40s, standing beside an unfinished fence in the yard of the first home I ever owned. I was smiling in the picture, a smile full of grit and certainty, a smile I had not seen on my face in decades. I held that photo in my hand and realized that the woman in it had never fully disappeared. She had only stepped aside for others. But now, she was sliding back into place, steadying herself, clearing her throat. The shift inside me did not roar. It hummed. It grew with every document I reviewed, every question I asked, every time I refused to be spoken over. It grew each time I sat in the quiet of my home and trusted the strength of my own mind. It grew every time I realized that awareness, not youth, is the heart of power. By the end of that week, the midpoint was complete, even if I did not yet recognize it by name. I stood in the center of my life, not as a woman fading, but as a woman awakening. I had been pushed toward the margins of my own story, but I knew now that I could step back into the center, not with rage, not with revenge, but with clarity. Clarity that I was not done. Clarity that I did not owe them my silence. Clarity that my life was still mine, and I had no intention of surrendering it. I did not notice the second escalation immediately, because it did not arrive as a single event, but rather as a tightening of currents around me, a subtle coiling of pressure that made the walls of my life feel closer than before. It began with a strange stillness, a kind of unnatural quiet in the days that followed my small acts of reclaiming control, changing passwords, rearranging documents, calling offices myself instead of allowing my son to mediate every interaction. At first I believed it was coincidence, a simple lull in communication, but soon it became clear that the silence was not absence, it was strategy. My son called less frequently, which at first I welcomed, until I realized the gaps in contact were punctuated by sudden urgent messages asking whether I was home, whether I had eaten, whether I had considered reviewing the documents he mentioned weeks earlier. His tone no longer feigned gentleness. Instead, it carried a restrained irritability, as though my independence were an inconvenience he could tolerate only in small doses. One afternoon he arrived unannounced, his knock sharp and rhythmic, a sound that did not match the casual smile he wore when I opened the door. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, walking through my house with purposeful eyes, glancing at the countertops, the tables, the chairs, as if searching for evidence of the decline he needed me to fit into. He asked why my blood pressure monitor wasn't on the table where he'd last seen it, why the binder of documents was no longer beside the telephone, why my medications were stored in a different cabinet. I answered calmly, explaining that I preferred things this way, but each explanation seemed to tighten something in his expression, like a man realizing a tool he relied on had begun slipping from his grasp. Later that day, I discovered a voicemail from my daughter-in-law asking if everything was all right because my son had noticed I sounded off on the phone, a claim that was neither true nor even debatable because I had barely spoken more than 10 words during his surprise visit. She suggested, in that hushed, delicately concerned voice she reserved for conversations meant to leave no bruise while still cutting deeply, that it might be a good time to discuss long-term plans. She emphasized that no one wanted to pressure me, but it would give everyone peace of mind if I could put things in order. That phrase, put things in order, clung to me with a cold, metallic weight. It was the same phrase used in the emails, the same tone of administrative finality, dressed as compassion. They were no longer hinting. They were tightening the noose. Soon after, little disturbances began to appear in my life, details too precise to be accidental. I received a notification from my primary care clinic confirming a medication review appointment I had not scheduled. When I called to clarify, the nurse hesitated before explaining that someone acting on my behalf had requested the evaluation. I corrected her firmly, gave explicit instructions not to accept any third-party involvement, and hung up with the realization that boundaries I had never imagined needing were already being tested. The pharmacy called days later asking whether I wanted to consolidate my prescriptions for automatic pickups as previously requested. I knew immediately who had made the request. Autonomy, they had decided, was optional, something they could suspend whenever it complicated their plans. The pressure grew in intensity when my son invited me to dinner at their house. I nearly declined, but something inside me urged me to go, if only to understand how far they intended to push. Their home, always immaculate, felt unusually staged that evening, as though they had rehearsed for my arrival. The table was set perfectly, the lights dimmed to an inviting warmth, the air scented with an expensive candle that smelled of pine and faint citrus. My daughter-in-law greeted me with exaggerated kindness, her arms wrapping around me in a gesture that radiated performative affection. She pulled out a chair for me, a gesture she had never made before, and suddenly I felt like a guest of honor at a dinner arranged to persuade me of something I would not like. Throughout the meal, they steered the conversation with uncomfortable precision, asking about how I was sleeping, whether I had experienced any forgetfulness lately, whether it might be time to consider making things easier for myself. My son spoke softly but firmly, weaving concern with subtle accusations, suggesting he had noticed I seemed overwhelmed, that managing things alone at my age could become dangerous. My daughter-in-law nodded empathetically, chiming in with remarks about how many responsibilities I still handled on my own, how strong I had been, but how everyone reaches a point when letting someone else help is the mature thing to do. The mature thing. They used that phrase more than once, as though maturity meant surrender, as though wisdom amounted to letting someone else dismantle the life you built. At one point, my daughter-in-law placed a folder on the table with a soft thud that carried far more meaning than sound. She slid it toward me, smiling a smile that belonged on someone delivering condolences rather than paperwork. She told me there was no rush, that I could look it over whenever I felt ready, but that these documents would streamline everything and ensure that the transition would be smooth. I did not open the folder. I did not touch it. I simply looked at it, the cream-colored surface glowing faintly under the kitchen light, and understood that inside were the forms they had discussed in the emails, the revised power of attorney, the financial directives, the health care, authorizations, and perhaps even the notarization forms. They had assembled it carefully, patiently, waiting for the right moment to present it as a gift rather than a theft. I left their house that evening with the folder still sitting on the table, untouched, a silent defiance that seemed to unsettle them more than any argument would have. My son walked me to the door, his smile strained, his eyes carrying a mixture of irritation and disbelief. He hugged me, a stiff, obligatory gesture, and whispered that he was just trying to protect me. I looked up at him and realized, with startling clarity, that he was not trying to protect me. He was trying to protect the version of his future that depended on my absence. The escalation sharpened days later when I discovered an envelope in my mailbox from a law office I did not recognize. Inside was a letter requesting confirmation of a scheduled consultation regarding estate planning. I stared at the page, reading the words again and again, until it became evident that someone had attempted to initiate legal steps using my name. The letter did not accuse. It simply assumed my participation. I felt a heat rise inside me, not anger, but something more precise, a hardening resolve. They had crossed into territory they believed I would not notice. They had underestimated me so completely that they thought I would sign whatever they put in front of me, walk wherever they led, nod at whatever future they crafted. What they did not understand was that the quieter they tried to make me, the more sharply I could hear myself. One afternoon, while sorting through my desk, I found the old binder where I had kept financial statements from years earlier, back when I first bought my home. I flipped through the pages slowly, touching the ink that had not faded, remembering the strength I had once felt signing those papers, the confidence I had carried into the bank as a younger woman with determination in her stride. I realized that the woman who bought this house, who built a life within its walls, who survived loss, who raised a child alone for years, who stitched herself together after grief, she had not vanished. She had simply been quiet, and she did not intend to be quiet any longer. The escalation deepened further when my son appeared again at my doorstep, this time without a smile. He walked inside before I could protest, pacing across my living room with restless agitation. He told me he was worried, that he had noticed inconsistencies, that I had been difficult to reach, that he feared I was becoming forgetful. His voice rose and softened in alternating waves, a performance honed to manipulate, not to comfort. When I told him firmly that I was managing my own affairs, he laughed, a short, sharp sound edged with desperation, and told me I didn't understand how fragile things could become. I watched him then, watched the frantic flicker in his eyes, and realized he was no longer pretending. His urgency was real, not because he feared for my well-being, but because he feared he was losing control of a process he had believed was inevitable. He asked again, demanded, really, that I bring him the documents he needed. I told him no, with a calmness that surprised even me. His face tightened, the muscles around his mouth constricting, his shoulders stiffening. For a moment he looked like a boy again, a boy denied something he believed was his by right. And then the mask returned, smooth, composed, managerial. He left abruptly, without a hug, without a polite goodbye, and for the first time in years, I felt no guilt watching him go. I knew then that the escalation had reached a point of no return. They would not stop. They would not slow. They would not reconsider, but neither would I. And though I did not yet know the shape of what would come next, I understood the truth at the heart of the escalation. They had been building a future that required my disappearance, while I had begun building a present that required my presence. And in that clash of futures, something unspoken but powerful awakened within me. the undeniable certainty that the life they believed was slipping from my hands was, in fact, settling more firmly into them. I did not realize that the moment of culmination was approaching until the tension that had been tightening for weeks suddenly aligned itself into a single, unmistakable line of action, a path that felt both inevitable and strangely calm, as if all. The fear and hesitation that had weighed on me had finally settled into quiet resolve. It happened on a morning that looked deceptively ordinary, with a pale sun filtering through my curtains and the familiar creak of the house greeting me as I walked into the kitchen. Yet something in the air felt different, a kind of sharpened clarity that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. I had barely finished my tea when the phone rang, and the tone in the caller's voice, dry, professional, unaware of the storm it was about to confirm, told me everything I needed to know before the words even fully formed. Someone had attempted to access my insurance account again. Someone had asked questions about my coverage. Someone had implied that I was preparing to delegate my decisions due to recent cognitive concerns. The representative sounded concerned, not about my health, but about the unusual activity on my file. And as she explained the details, I felt no shock this time, only a steady warmth rising in my chest, the warmth of recognition and alignment. They had pushed far enough. They had stepped over the threshold of assumption into the territory of violation, and in doing so, they had given me exactly the proof I needed. After I hung up, I did not hesitate or wander through possibilities as I might have weeks earlier. Instead, I walked directly to the small drawer in my hallway where I kept the notebook filled with dates, names, inconsistencies, messages, statements, and every subtle attempt they had made to shape my future behind my back. The pages were thick with ink, each line a piece of a puzzle they had believed I wasn't capable of assembling. I gathered my medical reports, my insurance statements, the printouts of suspicious requests, the email thread they had mistakenly sent me, and the notes I had taken during phone calls. I placed everything in a neat stack, slid it into a folder, and took a slow, steady breath. I was not preparing for a confrontation with them. I was preparing for a conversation with someone who could see what I had seen, someone who understood that the exploitation of an elderly person does not always arrive with bruises or stolen jewelry, but often through manipulation hidden behind concern. Walking to the police station felt surreal, not because I feared the outcome, but because the act itself marked a shift so profound that each step seemed to echo with the weight of my entire life. I had always been the woman who forgave too easily, who explained away cruelty, who held on to relationships long after they stopped resembling love. But on that morning, I felt none of that softness. I felt composed, steady, and strangely dignified, as though I were finally stepping into the role I had abandoned years ago, the guardian of my own life. When I walked through the doors, the air was cool and smelled faintly of disinfectant, and for a moment I felt the decades fold back, revealing the woman I had once been, the one who filled out her own forms without hesitation, the one who spoke up for herself without trembling. The officer at the front desk looked young enough to be my grandson, but his expression changed subtly when I laid the folder on the counter and said, with a clarity that surprised even me, that I needed to report attempted financial exploitation. He did not dismiss me. He did not speak slowly or condescendingly. Instead, he guided me to a room, offered me water, and asked me to explain everything from the beginning. As I spoke, my voice did not waver. I described the email, the calls, the inquiries, the documents, the sudden pressure, the medical appointments I had not scheduled. I described the tone of their voices, the strategies, the manipulation disguised as care. And with each detail I offered, the officer's expression tightened, not with disbelief, but with recognition, a recognition that told me he had heard versions of this story before. He asked to see the documents. I handed over the folder, and he opened it carefully, scanning page after page with growing seriousness. He asked precise questions, his pen moving quickly over his notepad, and for the first time in months I felt the solid, grounding sensation of being believed. When he finished reviewing the documents, he looked at me with a sincerity so sharp it nearly broke something inside me. Not pity, not sympathy, but respect. He told me gently that what I had brought was substantial, that I had done the right thing, that this was not family tension or miscommunication, but a legitimate case. He explained the next steps, the investigation that would begin, the reports they would file, the potential legal actions. And as he spoke, I realized the culmination was not in confronting my son, not in shouting or accusing or demanding explanations, but in trusting institutions I had never imagined I would need. When I left the station, the wind had picked up and the sky was a muted gray, the kind of sky that feels like a held breath. I walked slowly to my car, not because I was tired, but because I carried a fullness in my chest that needed room. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something quieter and deeper, the knowledge that I had protected myself, that I had stepped out of the silent surrender they expected and into a stance that did not require power or youth, only truth. Sitting in the car, I watched a few golden leaves swirl across the pavement, and for the first time since all of this began, I felt the weight of the situation lift slightly, not gone but redistributed, shared now with people who had the authority to intervene, to witness, to respond. My son called later that evening, his voice unusually strained, as though he sensed something had shifted and could not yet identify the source. He asked if I was all right, if I had been out, if I had remembered to take my medications. His questions were laced with a kind of frantic warmth, a tone he used only when he felt something slipping out of his control. I answered gently, evenly, offering nothing he could use as leverage, and when I hung up, I felt a vast, calm certainty settle inside me. The culmination was not in what I said to him, but in what I no longer needed to say. The real climax came the next morning when I received a call from the detective assigned to my case. His voice was steady, professional, carrying the weight of someone who had seen far too many families unravel in similar ways. He confirmed they had already found evidence of unauthorized inquiries, suspicious behavior, and potential attempts to alter my information without consent. He told me they would be contacting my son, not with accusations, but with questions he would not be prepared to answer. And in that moment, as I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, I felt something irreversible shift through my life like a quiet earthquake. I had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, not because I had burned bridges, but because I had built one for myself, a bridge to safety, to dignity, to truth. And as I ended the call, the light through the window seemed brighter, clearer, not because the world had changed, but because I had finally stepped into it fully, without the weight they had tried to place on my shoulders. I did not expect the resolution to arrive so quietly, without drama or the sharp edges of confrontation, but rather as a soft settling of truth into the spaces where fear had once lived, a gradual clearing of the air around me until my own breath felt like something I could trust again. It came slowly, in the days after the detective's call, when the house began to feel less like a place under watch and more like a sanctuary I had reclaimed by simply refusing to disappear. The silence that followed their inquiries was different from the silence of the weeks before. It was not the silence of plodding or pressure, but the silence that comes when someone realizes the person they underestimated has stepped fully into her own name. My son did not come to the house. He called once, his voice uneasy, carrying the strain of someone who had been forced into an unexpected conversation with authority. But I did not pick up. I let the phone ring. I let the moment pass. I let the truth do what truth always does when spoken aloud. It rearranges the shape of a relationship without needing permission. In that new quiet, I found myself moving through my home with a steadiness I had not felt in years. I cleaned out drawers I had ignored, sorted through closets that held decades of memories, and touched each object with a renewed sense of ownership, not because I feared losing anything, but because I understood now how close I had come to surrendering without even realizing it. I made a pot of soup that filled the house with a warm, familiar aroma, and as the steam rose in soft ribbons, I felt a grounding within me, as though the simple act of cooking had restored something elemental. I sat by the window with a blanket across my lap and let the afternoon light wash gently over me, the house settling around me with its old, comforting sighs. For the first time in months, I felt unobserved, unassessed, unmeasured. I felt whole. A few days later, the detective called again, updating me with a voice that carried both reassurance and gravity. He said the situation was being documented formally, that my statements and evidence had been added to the report, that steps had been taken to ensure no changes could be made to my accounts or records without my direct involvement. He spoke of rights, protections, options, words that once would have overwhelmed me, but now felt like tools placed gently in my hands. When he finished speaking, he paused, as though searching for the right way to close the conversation, and then said, with a warmth that surprised me, that I had done something many people my age were too frightened to attempt. I thanked him, but what I did not tell him was that I had not acted out of bravery. I had acted because the alternative was to let myself vanish. In the quiet that followed, I began to rediscover the small rituals of my life, the ones that had been overshadowed by tension and doubt. I walked around my garden, touching the brittle stems of late-season flowers, feeling the earth give softly beneath my feet. I swept the porch, noticing how the wind had blown leaves into gentle piles along the steps. I wrote in my old notebook, not lists or evidence this time, but thoughts, reflections, fragments of memory that felt like they belonged to a version of myself I had nearly forgotten. And through these simple acts, I realized the resolution was not in the legal process or the protective measures, but in the quiet return of myself to myself. I understood, too, that nothing would ever return to what it had been before. The fracture in my relationship with my son was real, and though I did not hate him, I no longer carried the illusion that love excused erasure. I felt sadness, yes, a deep maternal sorrow for the boy he once was, for the man he became, for the distance that had grown between us long before the emails confirmed it. But beneath that sadness was a calm certainty. I had chosen truth over comfort and dignity over fear, and that choice once made does not reverse itself. As the days unfolded with a gentler rhythm, I found myself thinking often about the women who live through similar shadows, women whose families speak of them in soft tones while quietly tightening the circle around their autonomy. I thought of how many of them never see the emails, never catch the phone calls, never find the inconsistencies until it is too late. And I wished, with a tenderness that surprised me, that they could sit where I sat now, in a home still their own, breathing air that had not been taken from them, feeling the strength that comes from simply refusing to fade. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a muted gold, I sat by the window and whispered something into the quiet of the room, not as a proclamation, but as a truth I wanted to release into the world. That age does not make us invisible, and vulnerability does not make us disposable. I said it softly, but it felt like a vow. And in that moment, I knew the resolution was not just the end of this story. It was the beginning of a new understanding of myself, one that would not be undone by anyone's expectations.